Oh, now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth Planetary Boundaries MOOC Hangout. And welcome to the start of another new year, of course. I'm very happy to welcome Kate Raworth to this Hangout. She's currently in Oxford, and we are currently here in Stockholm, so we may have one or two settling down issues as we start to have this discussion. But we've got some great questions to start with, and so I'd like to open by inviting Kate to introduce herself to us all.
Hi, thanks Sarah, and it's a real pleasure to join the MOOC. Yeah, I'll just say a little bit about where I'm coming from, because we're all coming from somewhere and it shapes how we think. I trained as an economist at university 20 years ago and was really frustrated by what I learned, because I found that most of the theory didn't address the issues that I cared about. In those days, you couldn't even study environmental economics. It just wasn't even an option available. And so I walked away from economics and refused to call myself an economist for decades. I worked in the villages of Zanzibar, I worked at the United Nations, and I worked for Oxfam for many years, working on social and environmental issues. And it drove me back to economics, and I've eventually decided to call myself an economist, but to try and reclaim what economics is. And in 2009, when I came back from maternity leave, somebody sent me a picture of this planetary boundaries, and I had this shot of adrenaline. I felt I was seeing, even before I quite knew what I was seeing, I knew I was seeing something very important. For me, seeing the picture of planetary boundaries was like seeing natural scientists say to economists, look economists, if you won't recognize that the economy is a subset of the biosphere, then we're going to do it for you. We're going to draw a box around the economy. And here it is, we've drawn it, it's 9 boundaries. And by the way, we've drawn it not in your metrics, it's not monetized. We've drawn it in our metrics of tons of carbon, tons of nitrogen. So you have to learn somebody else's language now to talk about the world in which the economy exists. That's what I saw. And I thought it was incredibly exciting, because it seemed like a very important rebalancing between the disciplines. But I was sitting in the middle of Oxfam at the time when we were working on poverty, destitution, lack of education, lack of water, lack of energy. And I saw that something was missing, and that's what prompted me to say, well, if there's an environmental ceiling on the outside, there's a social foundation in the middle as well. So I put in the inside, and hey presto, this circle turned into a donut. So that's where it came from. And I'm now in the process of writing a book called Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And the idea of it is, if you took the donut picture as the goal, one very top level, simple but clear, powerful goal of where we want to get to in the 21st century, what would you want to be the mindset of today's economists? How would you want them to think? So that's what I'm passionate about, rethinking economics in the light of putting the values we care about, like ecological integrity and human rights, at the heart of what the economy is for. So that's where I'm coming from, and very much looking forward to this discussion.
So are we now. I'm going to write down on my piece of paper something about keeping values at the heart, because I think that's also a big motivation for many of us, including many of the people taking the MOOC. But the first question that I want to pick up from the forum questions is from Abelardo Brenes. And he says, luckily he's seen your YouTube presentation on Doughnut Economics. He says, you seem to put faith mostly in political leaders. Do we need a more sophisticated approach on means and ways to achieve these changes? Do you want to launch into that?
Sure, right. So you might have got the impression I was putting faith in political leaders, because in the video that I think you watched, I showed what if we each put our own life around this donut table and asked ourselves, how does the way I live, consume, vote, bank impact on the donut? I also showed companies and asked, what would the world look like if they strategized for their corporate brands around a donut-shaped table? But then I showed a picture of the world leaders, imaginarily, sitting around a donut-shaped table. So I'll start by saying I do put, not faith, but importance in political leaders. And I'll come on to more than that. Of course they're important. And actually now is a particularly important time. We've got the world's governments focusing on drawing up a set of sustainable development goals. And that process, following the Millennium Development Goals, is as close as you get in international politics to saying, what are we here for? What do we stand for? What are our collective values at the heart of what we're doing as an international community? A lot of people are very dismissive of the SDGs and say it's a lot of talk. I think it's really important that at some point, every decade or so, the world's leaders and the world's countries sit down and say, what are we trying to achieve together? If we didn't have that dialogue, what would it be driven by instead? So I do place importance and faith in speaking to political leaders and also ensuring that they have a new language to speak with, because since, say, the 1950s and 60s, they've been trapped in the language of growth. Economic growth is the framing of what we mean when we talk about progress. And yet we're more and more aware that that's not enough, because we have human deprivation, massively rising inequality, and environmental degradation. So we know that the language and framing of growth isn't enough. And we need to help give political leaders a new language and a new framing of something else that they can talk to. So the European Union Commissioner for Environment, Yanis Potočnik, a couple of years ago gave a speech called Towards Universal Prosperity, Human Well-Being Within Planetary Boundaries. That was the title of his speech. That's really fantastic progression, because he's not saying universal prosperity and growth. He's saying universal prosperity is well-being within planetary boundaries. Once we've got key political figures starting to talk like that, we're helping to shift the narrative of what they can tell the public, therefore. But then let me just say, I don't believe political, it's not the place, the starting point for change. I'd say you want to change political figures, you want to change the way corporate business works, you want to change the media dialogue, you want to change individual citizens and what they vote for and aspire for, and change civil society and mass movements. And I think of them all arrayed like a little group of bumper cars that have got stuck. You know, when you go on the bumper cars and you get stuck. And we're all stuck together, because to change governments we need to change the public, but to change the public we need to change the media, but to change the media we need to change the corporations, to change the corporations we need to change the government. Everything needs to move at the same time, so you need to be communicating on many levels. So I work with companies and talk directly through corporate education, trying to get companies to think differently, so they'll lobby governments differently, talk with governments, talk with civil society, talk with individuals. We've got to shift all those bumper cars at the same time. So I don't put it only faith, and certainly political leadership isn't the place I believe we start from, but I certainly wouldn't dismiss it as not important.
I'm going to link you on to another question that's come up as well, which is a question of timeframes. And actually our resilience perspective also tells us something about the fact that we have all of these different players. I love your visual imagination on this, actually, these different bumper cars that are locked into their kind of respective positions. A resilience perspective tells us that we need that kind of diversity. These different kinds of institutions and organizations and individuals are effective on different time frames and across different scales. And we need them all together. There's a question in the list somewhere on timeframes, recognizing that, for instance, political interests have timeframes of a term of office, say 3, 4, 5 years. But the donut is obviously a very big and ambitious prospect, perhaps a long-term framework. How do you see that challenge?
Yeah, so we're not easily going to get rid of the challenge that elections run on 4 or 5 year cycles, and every government wants to be calling for the next election, and so peaking somehow the output of its work around election time, often to the detriment of the future. That's not easy to overcome. But again, I think thinking back to what are the metrics by which governments, by which we measure them, or by which they declare their prowess. One of the main metrics is the performance of the economy, right? The economy is growing, green shoots of recovery are coming through, and it's a measure of GDP, gross domestic product, every year. And if we allow, again, if we allow the narrative of what we think we're doing together in the world to be around getting the economy to grow, then it is a very short-term measure, and it goes up and down very quickly. If we had a much richer framework of saying, well, actually, where we're trying to get to is within planetary boundaries, and we were more ecologically literate as a public, as a corporate body, as governments, then we could start saying, well, what's the record of my government in terms of building the ecological integrity of the world from my country's perspective? And then we'd start looking at whether they're running down the stocks of natural capital, if you want to put it that way, whether they're contributing to bringing us back in that donut over time. I mean, just by analogy, if you have a child and you want your child, the long-term interest, you want your child to go to university and get a good education, you wouldn't only judge them by their immediate homework. I'm trying to make this up on the spot, but we have long-term interests, and yet we're not caught up in only judging them on the short term and putting the long term in jeopardy. We do know how to have long-term interests in our own lives. So we need ways of thinking about measuring government performance that take account of long-term metrics and are part of a longer-term vision. I also think there's a problem in that because we don't really generally think in systems thinking and realize that each economy is a little bubble in the global economic system, and it's buffeted around by so many forces. We still live in political narratives in which governments seem to try to take responsibility for the fact that the economy is doing really well right now, whether it's actually to do with something happening on the other side of the world, or try to reject criticism that the economy is doing badly, and they try to say, well, that was due to the last government. It's due to so many forces beyond their control. Governments can really try and help to make the economy resilient on the waves of the international economy, but we haven't yet shifted our understanding of that and seen that a national economy is not sovereign under individual government. It can't be held responsible for everything that happens in it. So we need to change the way we assess what we think is happening every 4 to 5 years. But there are some projects, the project of the clock of the long now, trying to extend our imaginative timeline. We've become very short-termist, and people cite the Indian proverb, you must look after things thinking of the 7th generation henceforth. Or the Chinese proverb which says, if you're planning for a year, plant rice. If you're planning for a decade, plant a tree. If you're planning for a lifetime, teach people. And we're still caught in this kind of planning for a year cycle. We need to change the metrics by which we live, and to do that I think we need to change the vision of what we're aiming for, and that's why I think the donut can help reframe us on a much bigger, grander, longer term timescale.
We've got two questions that you've triggered in your discussions here. One of them, I'm going to say which the two questions are, but I think the one that I want you to deal with first is a question by Vivek Babu, who says, do you see the social boundary model evolving towards a kind of compliance-based regime, or is it just goal setting? And you talked about, accountability, traceability, the role of governments in this. Do you see any moves in either academia or in policy institutions to push compliance on your social foundation boundaries? You also mentioned children, so I'll just give you a heads up that the next question will be about how we involve children in sustainable living. But for now, stick to the politics.
Okay, so on compliance, I'm guessing that Vivek's question is coming from a position of thinking that there might be more compliance going on around the environmental ceiling or the planetary boundaries, and saying should there also be around the social foundation. I don't know if that's what he means, but I'd actually say it's the other way around. We've had a regime of compliance on what I've called the social foundation since 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was first drawn up, and then since then, over several decades, from 1948 through to around the 1990s, we had convention after convention of economic, social, cultural, civil and political rights, and almost every single one of the issues that's mentioned in the social foundation is recognized as a human right and has been ratified by probably over 100 countries. So actually there's a lot of compliance around that. When I first drew the donut, I'll say that I was concerned when I first showed it to Earth system scientists such as yourself, that people say, well, it's very nice, Kate, nice little picture, but the outer boundary is really hard science, and this, what you've drawn in the middle, it's all a bit soft, fluffy social stuff. And then I gradually realized actually the social stuff is much more internationally, legally grounded. We've got, it's been in place, it's been discussed by the world's governments for decades. We've got strong agreements on what this is. So there should be a regime of compliance around it, around human rights law. Of course, it's extremely poorly implemented because human rights law is mostly within countries. It's very hard to hold a company or a government to account across countries, and we see all sorts of people attempting to use human rights law on environmental and social grounds, and it still doesn't have full traction. But I think there is compliance there. I think certainly at the level of companies, there's more interest in should they have compliance, and some progressive companies are saying, what if we hold ourselves accountable for these and we actually leap ahead of legislation and say we're going to account for this. So you can take I can't. Which was the shoe company? Was it Adidas who said we're going to do social and environmental accounting, profit and loss accounts for our shoes? We're actually going to look at. No, it was Puma. Sorry, it was Puma. We're going to look at the social and environmental profit and loss account. We're going to hold ourselves accountable. They put it in monetary terms, which I don't always agree with. I think we need more metrics, and everything doesn't get turned into money. But I think we are entering into an era where we're going to have more requirements of compliance for sure, and I think that can only be a good thing.
We can bring Osbert's question up the list in a minute as well. It's great, we're getting loads and loads of questions appearing on the forum, but yeah, I want to bring you back to this issue of sustainable living and the next generation and children, and what can we do? And
I'm a mother of 6-year-old twins, a girl and a boy, and so that's a very real question in my own life, whether it's them saying to me, "Mummy, what is it you're doing when you go off and do your donut?" and trying to explain what that is, or how I educate them, how I teach them. And I think I've talked to my children about carbon dioxide since they were 2 or 3, on the basis that we teach children about germs and why you need to wash your hands, and they understand the pollution of the human body, right? It's one of the fundamentals you teach them. You wash your hands to be clean, and we understand about pollutants. So why don't we teach them about, not just about the bodily system, but about the earth system? And I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, our lack of ecological literacy is one of the fundamental problems. I never learned about ecology when I was at school. I never learned about earth system science. I never learned the word the Holocene. I didn't know any of this. And if you don't know any of this, how can somebody come and suddenly tell you the environment is important for your well-being, and suddenly understanding that there are life support systems that we depend upon? We don't know about that. We know everything about the human body. We all learn human biology. Why not learn earth biology, as it were, or earth system science? So I think one of the biggest favors we can do for the next generation, thinking back to that Chinese proverb, if you're planning for a lifetime, teach people, is to teach children ecological literacy, and to teach them that our well-being depends on each of us having the resources we need to meet our human rights, and that's what this social foundation is about. But our well-being also depends upon safeguarding the life support system that our planet gives us. Healthy soil, clean air, a protective ozone layer, biodiversity, renewed fresh water, stable climate. These are the earth systems on which our well-being depends. So that outer circle is our well-being as well. It's not a limit on our well-being. It's not our well-being within it. It is part of our well-being. I think we have to teach the children that. And then, as I said right at the outset, the thing I'm passionate about is once our children say, I think I want to study economics, I'm really passionate about what they get taught when they go to study economics. Because right now, if you go off and study economics at university, almost all of the core ideas you're taught are retrograde, I would say, in relation to understanding earth system science and human rights. They are the opposite of the thinking we need. So we are currently teaching a generation of economics students a mindset which will in no way equip them for the 21st century challenges that they are going to be policymakers in charge of.
I'm going to come in on this one too, because actually many of us involved in the education world are aware that we've just finished or are coming to the end of the UN's decade for education for sustainable development. But at the same time, many, many other people, including people in our own universities, have simply no awareness of this at all. So although we've got an international agreement that we should be teaching our children, and we in fact have been teaching our children about sustainable development for many years now, that hasn't really filtered back up to parents, and not necessarily, as you talked about economics. I'd actually also point at mainstream teaching of chemistry or mainstream teaching of even physics. We haven't been embedding sustainability into higher education. So speaking as the mother of a 20-year-old, I did a fantastic job at teaching him when he was 6. But this, as people become older and become more exposed to the social pressures, as they become more independent from family life, maintaining that awareness is a very special challenge. And I think that universities need to step up. And again, that's part of the reason we're experimenting with the MOOC. And we'd really appreciate feedback from everybody here on this as well. So yeah, how do we keep people aware of environmental issues through life, not just our children?
Yeah, and actually, just say on this MOOC and also the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which talks about circular economy, they ran what they called a Disruptive Innovation Festival from October, November last year. What you're covering on this MOOC, what they were covering in that festival, I would say is at the cutting edge of progressive education, but it hasn't yet found its way into the syllabus. So it's streets ahead of the syllabus, and yet, of course, we need this thinking in the syllabus as part of mainstream education now. So I worry that academia is very slow moving. Look at the economics students trying to get academics to revise economics. They say, well, yes, some changes may be necessary, but it's going to take some time. There's no sense of urgency of real world relevance. It's frustrating.
When's your book going to be finished?
I've got to hand it in at the end of October this year, and it's going to be coming out this time next year. Fantastic.
There's a whole set of questions here. We've got one. Okay, there's one that's been highlighted as a question for us to answer now. But again, on this issue of heads up, there's a whole set of questions about voice, about different cultures, about language rights, about women and gender and other aspects of diversity. If somebody's noticed your use of the phrase the manthropocene, which I still laugh rather sadly about. In the donut, you highlight voice. Do you want to sort of expand a little bit more on how to include this kind of, well, diversity and disenfranchised and critical voices in this conversation? Not just in terms of, sorry, there's several names here. Kim Locke asks about the disenfranchised, specifically in the context of economic questions. Vivek Babu, who asked an earlier question, is also interested in language rights and there was another one somewhere as well, but it's scooting up and down in the margin here. Sorry, I'm looking at the questions. Do you want to pick up on that issue, the sort of cultural diversity and all of the diversities that are embodied in vision of sustainability?
Yeah, let me just say one thing about this donut picture. The social foundation, the bits in the middle, just if I say quickly where they come from, because voice is there, and we've got gender equality here as well, but there are 11 dimensions here. Where do they come from? In the run-up to the Rio 20 conference, I was trying to think, how do I draw this social foundation? You know, the earth system scientists have drawn the planetary boundaries. Where do I get the equivalent, social equivalent from? And somebody gave me the fantastic idea of saying, why don't you go through every government submission to the Rio conference and see what they are saying are the social priorities? So it was a brilliant idea because it takes it out of any particular person's choice and says it's crowdsourced from the world's governments. So what I did was go through all their reports, look at every mention of a social issue, and then I pulled up all social issues that were mentioned by at least half of the government's reports, and hence it was those 11. A little bit further down the list, so it's kind of Millennium Development Goal things, plus voice, resilience, social equity. I think those ones that, and energy, that were particularly different from the MDGs. A bit further down the list, though, was Indigenous peoples and cultural rights. And it would have been great if it had come up onto that list, as were things like housing and personal security. They were further down the list. So just to be clear that this isn't this social foundation isn't definitive and closed. It was just a crowdsourcing of the most popular issues by governments at that moment. So voice and language rights and cultural rights, I agree, it really matters, and it really matters in how we frame this. Some people say, I've heard a lot of dialogue about, is the planetary boundaries concept, is it a very authoritarian one, and is it now scientists saying that these are the limits and taking the debate away from democracies or imposing a universal view of what we should be aspiring to on humanity? And there are challenges around that. Some people have said to me, for example, how do you know that everybody in the world needs to have all these social foundations? Who says everybody has to access to these things? To which my reply is, well, these are all essentially human rights, so it depends whether you accept the framing of human rights or not. It also, it doesn't... Oh.
Busy lady.
I don't know what that was. It's gone. Where was I? Yeah, so the fact that everything is there in the social foundation doesn't mean that everybody must use electricity, must use all these resources, but either that they can have access to them. It's very much the Amartya Sen idea that people have the capability to have access to all these resources rather than they must use all of them. We're not trying to bring everybody up to a certain standard of living. The questions that have come, so I'm not sure specifically which angle on disenfranchisement or cultural rights that we're asking about, but I do think so come back to the Anthropocene idea, there has for too long been a dominance of a particular group of voices, and it's been particularly northern, male and white, determining around science. And I wrote a piece about saying, must the Anthropocene be a manthropocene? Because I was just seeing panel after panel pretty much male dominated, and yet I know there's so many women bringing their views in. And I wrote a piece which was put in The Guardian and drew so much hate mail in response, which was quite extraordinary. It really made me think about, well, why do different people's views bring different perspectives? And I again, thinking back from economics, when women start writing about economics, they talk about very different things. They say, of course, you have to talk about the unpaid care economy. When people from the global south start talking about economics, they talk about it differently. They'll talk about dependency or exploitation, or they'll recognize power relationships straight off, where people who've come from a much more privileged position haven't seen it. So where we come from does shape how we see the world, which is why I started off saying where I come from and who I am. We're all subjective. That's why cultural, gender, social diversity matters if we're going to do a good job of framing where we're trying to get to, because as a diverse group we will do so much better than as a narrow group with a similar mind. We're always going to miss things, right? We're never going to see the whole. The more different voices we bring in, the more likely we are to spot gaps or problems or in the framing that we've done. So I think it's incredibly important to recognize cultural diversity. I don't know exactly how to bring it into this model, but I know you, Sarah, have been working on some projects about looking at thinking of their Anthropocene from many cultures' different point of view. Maybe you want to say something about that project.
I think the short answer is it is really very difficult, and my overwhelming summary of all of the work we do is there's absolutely no substitute for dialogue. I mean, I think that we can, it's important that we take the best of our knowledge and abstract it and analyze it at the sort of very broad-brushed global level, but that has to be complemented with the actual dialogue with people's lived experience. I mean, I think, again, this goes back to the conversation we had right at the very beginning of this session, where we were, talking about why we might still need to talk to governments. Governments are accountable to their, for better or worse, accountable to their people in their countries. Local communities should be engaging in this. And so somehow we ought to maintain, I think, I think it's essential, I think it's at the heart of sustainability that we maintain places for dialogue that really mean meaningful engagement, meaningful listening to people's needs. There was a question fleetingly, actually, a comment by Osbert Lancaster, I think his name was, on whether you're right to frame Doughnut Economics as economics. Doesn't economics put people off when we might be interested in issues of environmental justice, for instance? I thought you'd laugh at that one. Go on.
No, I'm not laughing. I think it's a great question, because I've been calling myself an economist for years. So, so my reply would be that the first economist was Xenophon in ancient Greece, living in Athens, and he wrote he predated the magazine The Economist by many centuries. He wrote a book, a little pamphlet called The Economist. And eco and nomos are the two Greek words that he put them together. And eco means household, and nomos means norms or rules or management. So economos, it means economics, or the economist means the household manager. And if you read his book, he's saying, here's my friend with a great household estate with land and fields and a home and slaves, and how should he best manage his household? And it's literally about how to manage an estate. And then towards the end of Xenophon's life, he wrote a new book on the policies for Athens, his hometown. And he wrote about trade policies and tariffs and public investments. Fascinating. He was writing about the economics, the household management of a city-state. And then 2,000 years later in Scotland, Adam Smith wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations. now we're not just talking about a single household or the city-state, but he moved to the nation-state, and he was talking about the household management of the nation-state and what makes one household, what makes one nation wealthy and another not. And I think we need to take the logical next step. So we are in the era of the planetary household. We, as a generation connected by the internet, we know how many of us there are. There's around 7 billion, probably going to be 9 billion. We can instantly be connected to almost anybody on a mobile phone. We have news instantly. You know, our trade and globalization means we really recognize ourselves as globally connected like never before. We are a planetary household. So for me, Doughnut Economics is the management of our planetary household. How do we manage the well-being of 7 coming on 9 billion people within with ecological integrity of the life support systems that we depend upon? So I put it like that because I do think we need to reclaim economics. Economics has come to mean finance, money, profit. And that's such a thin meaning of what it stands for. It's household management, and God, we need some good household managers, you know? We really need some fantastic household managers over the coming 50 years. So I've decided to try and reclaim the term.
I'll try and find out who it was who made a comment about money specifically, but we'll cross-link to that. But there's a question, a really interesting question that I know that both you and I have been interested in recently by Susan Shaw asks, is following on from the compliance question. How do we think that concepts, structures, and principles of international law can support planetary boundaries? What new concepts are coming out? And I'll start just very briefly by saying that this is, I mean, both Kate and I have been speaking with a group of environmental lawyers who are very interested in exploring this question. Kate might want to come in on a little bit more of that, but I think there's we can break it down into different aspects. In many ways, the first step is just to say, to what extent does current international law map onto the issues that we regard as important, the critical issues from a planetary boundaries perspective? In many cases, we have laws in place. The big problem is we've got enormous implementation gaps. There's some really new ideas that are coming out. Susan, you might be interested in looking at the idea of the Earth condominium, the idea that we need to share, to just the same as in a condominium arrangement, an owner of an apartment is responsible for their own living space, but we have a collective responsibility for the shared functions and spaces of the condominium. We should, you know, it's a very flexible form of a very flexible legal arrangement, and we might want to take that kind of flexibility and bring it all the way up to the planetary scale. I find that idea just fascinating. It certainly shifts some of the discussion about international law. Kate, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so not being a lawyer, I'm not going to try and map the law onto the frameworks, but what I understand is the law was not drawn up with an understanding of Earth system science. So just as human rights were drawn up in 1948 in the era totally predating globalization, totally before climate change, we now find it very hard to apply old law to a new context because it wasn't designed to meet it. And I think those laws need updating. I think human rights law needs updating to recognize that climate change is a violation of human rights. Likewise, I think environmental law needs to be updated to recognize Earth system science and global public goods. But that, yes, Peter Roderick, who's a lawyer who's done a lot of work in this area, put together a very nice initiative drafting, saying, why don't we have a draft UN declaration on planetary boundaries? And he wrote up a draft as if it was going to be a UN declaration, which is a great advocacy tool, drawing something up and saying, well, why shouldn't
why isn't it here? Yes.
And it says, you know, we, the undersigned, the United Nations of the world, commit to, he talked about recognizing, respecting, and protecting. So we will recognize planetary boundaries. We will actually recognize that there are life support systems upon which we depend. We will aim to research them, to understand them better, so we have a continual process of better understanding. So a really nice point of saying, we're not saying that today's science is the be-all and end-all, it's the final word on it. It's an evolving process. And we will aim to realize and protect and respect them. So we will take action So it was a very nicely worded piece. I mean, it's called the Planetary Boundaries Initiative, and you can go to their website and read that and comment on it. So I think pieces like that, or Polly Higgins, who's talked about ecocide and trying to create the international law of ecocide, really good people using the law as it stands and trying to innovate around it. This is where progress comes from. But it's really important to recognise we understand new and different things about the world we live in and how it works, and we need to bring the law up to make sure the law maps onto the world that we want to protect. So I think it's very exciting that lawyers are trying to do this, and I know they get caught in what the law does not allow, but I think advocacy, so Sheila Cloutier, who is trying to use human rights law on climate change, people trying and pushing and bringing cases, even though they know they're going to lose them, as an advocacy tool, it's very important to show this is the limit of the law and it shouldn't be. We need to evolve it.
Yeah. Talking of evolution, it was Aisha Sakar's question on what you think about the monetary system that we have right now. Do we need a new monetary system, Kate?
Yes, we do. Yeah, I think the finance system we have has, when you study economics, you're taught that the finance system is a sort of tertiary sector and it serves the real economy and that banks simply balance savings and investments. Complete fiction that's written up in the textbooks and taught. And the world is only just waking up to how money actually works. I mean, the Bank of England only last year published for the first time in hundreds of years of its history a pamphlet which said, we officially recognise that banks, private banks, commercial banks create money. That's where most money comes from. 97% of money in the UK is created by banks in the form of credit. So economists are completely behind in understanding where money really comes from. So they've been caught completely off the hoof and unable to analyse things like the financial crisis well. I think the fundamental shift we need is systems thinking, both in terms of understanding Earth system processes, but also understanding money. And I'm not surprised that we've been through booms and crashes. People are now looking back to John Maynard Keynes, who was probably one of the first systems thinkers in finance and economics, saying there's a cycle going on, guys, and it can get stuck in a low equilibrium or high, and we need to kick it and move it around. It's dynamic. Or Hyman Minsky, who said the finance sector is inherently unstable. You're crazy if you think that having liberal finance markets will create stability. It's the opposite. It's inherently unstable. So economists are starting to wake up to systems dynamics because they're realizing that the finance system is highly dynamic. And it's become the tail that wags the dog. You know, the finance system calls the shots over the real economy. So yes, we need new money. Well, I think also we need to realize that the kind of money we have is one of the only forms, it's just one form you can have. It's a monoculture of money. It's interest bearing. You don't have to have interest bearing money. You could have money that doesn't bear interest or even has a demirage that loses value if you hold it. People like Brett Scott has written a great book called A Hacker's Guide to Global Finance, which explains to you how the finance system works and then talks about ways of hacking into it and redesigning money. Or Bernard Lietaer has written a great book called The Future of Money. We definitely need to redesign money, but first of all, we need to reclaim the power of the financial system, which has done a brilliant job of getting itself deregulated, so it's globally more powerful than governments and has governments at its beck and call. It's completely the tail wagging the dog at the cost of environmental degradation and social destruction. It's obviously the main problem. So yes, I agree. We have to reclaim money and understand it. So getting ourselves to understand how it actually works is the first stop in rewriting it.
I'm going to pick up a question from Hannah Elvery, who says she's interested in whether you've come across any resistance or criticism of the donut concept. And if you have, what strategies do you use to talk about it to people who are resistant?
I'd like to come across more resistance to it, because I think critique is a really great form of changing your thoughts. So I always invite criticism of it. And if anybody has any criticisms, I'd love to hear them. What's the resistance? Well, one of the comments I get back is planetary boundaries, you know, really, are they real? Aren't most of them regional? So the critique of the planetary boundary framework. But I know this MOOC will no doubt have covered a lot of that and looked at that. Resistance. Some people might say by drawing all those things into the social foundation, you're saying everybody has to have this standard of living. You're saying everybody has to have energy and education and a certain level of income. To which you know, how do you know everybody wants these things? To which I'd say, well, I'm drawing on the body of international human rights law, so I'm just taking that as a given that people have a claim, and actually if you look at the level I'm setting here, it's such a minimal claim of right. I've traveled to quite a few poor communities in the world with my work with Oxfam, and I've never been to a community that would say they didn't want that basic level. And people often say on gender issues, you know, how do you know that you're trying to push cultural change here? Again, if you go into communities, you always find women who are fighting or quietly trying to change the cultural balance and the gender balance in their community in order to strengthen their own rights. Oh, I know one critique. People have said, when I first drew this in 2012, I took it to the United Nations in the run-up to the Rio+20 conference. I took it to New York, and I went round all the different embassies and talking to the delegates, showing them this picture, saying, "What do you think?" Which was fascinating, actually. Talk about the culture, hearing different cultures' feedback on it. But some people said, "Well, where's the economy? Where, as a mainstream economic thinker, how do you get the finance minister involved in this?" I mean, the finance minister can't see economy here, right? Because it starts with 9 planetary boundaries, and it starts with health and education. So it doesn't start with the main language of economics. Where's growth? Why haven't you put growth in it, for example? And I think that's an interesting question. To me, it says, well, why does economics not even start with the fundamentals of what we care about? Economics jumps right in and talks about supply and demand. So it's a shortfall, I think, in economics that it doesn't look to the values that it's promoting. But it is a challenge in communicating it and making mainstream economists think this is relevant to me rather than this is hokey. One criticism that I get several times from people who are very concerned about the global population, they say, why haven't you included population in here? You should have it in the social foundation. Why did you leave it out? Is it a conspiracy that you left it out? To which I say it shouldn't be in the social foundation. Population, I mean, the social foundation is trying to pick out the key issues that every human being has a claim upon in their life. And the bigger the global population is, the further out this line will go, because it will take more resources to meet the social foundation for a larger population. So it's quite clear that as you go further and further out, this would get thinner as the global population gets larger. But to be honest, the real pressure on the planet, the donut, is not getting everybody in the world out of poverty. That's actually a small fraction of the pressure. The real pressure is the lifestyle of the highly affluent. So half of the global carbon emissions in the world are due to the lifestyles of around 11% of people. If you want to tackle climate change, you tackle the high carbonista lifestyles. You don't say people living in poverty at the moment can't have access to electricity. So the population question, I suppose, is one that's come up, but I feel quite happy to deal with that. But I do really like criticisms of it, partly because I'm writing a book. I'm thinking of revising it at the moment. It's really helpful to hear people's critiques of what doesn't work or what's missing in order to strengthen it, because I do think we need strong, visual, simple images that people could say, I get that. Like planetary boundaries, so many people get it. It's taught a whole generation of people to understand Earth system science who never did a science degree, including myself. And I think we need something similar that puts environmental and social together. So I'm really determined to make this donut as accessible as possible. So like I said, if you use the MOOC hashtag, please send me any critiques and ideas for improving it that you've got.
Cool. We like hashtags. Actually, these comments just now have pretty much answered a question from Jesper Ekelund on whether we need economic growth for development and how to lift many in the developing world out of poverty. I mean, it's very clear that we could do with growth in some sectors if our real objective is making space for people to lift themselves out of poverty. Would you agree?
Yep. I think in low-income countries, economic growth, as in an increase in the gross domestic product of the country, the monetized value of output, is essential, because that means people's incomes are rising. Of course, the distribution of that matters. If you had GDP growth in any country, which is all being accrued by the top 1%, that's not going to do anything for tackling poverty. So we have to always care about the distribution of growth. But absolutely, low-income countries and many middle-income countries need to see their economy growing. The narrative, as I said at the outset, is for growth. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goal draft, growth is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I find problematic. Because so my focus when we talk about green growth, right? People love to talk about green growth, and they mean we can have GDP rising while we reduce it or decouple it from resource use so that we can keep carbon emissions flat, or even have them absolutely falling, or water use, or any particular mineral or timber or whatever resource, we can have GDP rising and reduce our throughput of resources. That's the decoupling debate. If high-income countries think that they're going to achieve green growth, they have to really get very, very serious about the scale of decoupling that requires, because whether or not we grow, we need to massively reduce our resource use from the level it's at now. We need to massively cut our carbon emissions and water use. If we want to grow, we need to cut it even more. What really worries me about the Sustainable Development Goal draft that I've seen is that under the goal for growth, it says countries should grow according to national circumstance, but everybody's growing. Only under the goal for, I think it's called something like planet or planet ecological integrity, it says one little line about, oh, countries should try to decouple. Now, if you're serious about living within planetary boundaries and you say you want to have a growth, you would put decoupling smack center of your economic strategy. It would be, of course, fueling masses of innovation and new companies and all sorts of business, because you would have to be innovating to how on earth are we going to do that. It's just offered as a little byline, do it if you want to. So the world's governments have not taken seriously what it means to say we still want growth, but yes, we're newly committed to ecological integrity, because the idea of decoupling and sufficient absolute decoupling is not on the agenda. So I'm really worried about that, and I think anybody who cares about understanding the economy in relation to the environment has to be on top of that decoupling debate. When's it been done? Where's it been done? How has it been done? Is it a one-off example, or is it a new paradigm? Be really suspicious of the green growth paradigm, I'd say, because every single, and when I teach students, I say, look, you're sitting in university right now, you have the freedom to think. The minute you leave university, you're probably going to join a consultancy or a government or an international agency or a company. Every single one is part of the green growth paradigm. You'll have it on your business card. You'll have it on your name tag. You'll be working under an ideology that we believe green growth is possible. It's not yet been proven. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying it's not yet been proven. It's very dangerous that there's so little dialogue around it. There's so few people who are looking for prosperity without growth, like Tim Jackson or Peter Victor in Canada. And it's seen as a fringe activity, a bit hokey, off the edge, totally non-mainstream, not politically acceptable. And yet the mainstream have not checked out the path that they claim they can follow. So I'm very suspicious when I see everything framed under green growth, because we are following an ideology that we haven't yet told ourselves is possible.
I'm going to have a quick look down the list of questions that have come up, because actually I think that last comment you made touches a little bit on Ariel Klein's question about whether financial mechanisms like carbon taxes and cap and trade have potential, and about the limits of capitalism in its current configuration. There was another, can we just scoot down a little bit? There was another question about, okay, we'll leave it at that for now on that topic. I wanted to pick up on a question that came up earlier, actually, by just very briefly, while we're still thinking explicitly about the Doughnut framework as well. Lewis Conway's question, how is resilience actually defined in the social foundations of Doughnut Economics? And he specifically links this to questions, and there's several questions in the forum list about vulnerability and differential vulnerability of different people and groups in society. So Lewis's question is specifically about applications to disaster risk. But yeah, start with the first question. How is resilience defined in your social foundations? And then we can see about how we deal with these broader questions of vulnerability.
Yeah, okay. So as I said earlier on, the way I drew up the social foundation was to go through the submissions of every government to the UN conference at Rio and look at the social issues that they were mentioning. And lots of governments were talking about, they used the word resilience, disaster risk reduction, adaptation, vulnerability, right? So these were the key words that kept coming up, and I framed them all, in order to keep it really simple and have few words, I framed them all under this concept of resilience. It was very clear that governments were talking about, this is a priority, that we have health and education and energy, and we have it with resilience. And when I put it in the social foundation, some people said to me, but I don't think that's a separate thing. I mean, that if you have all those other things, if you have education and income and water and health and food, that is what it means to have resilience. And at first I thought, oh, you might be right. But then I thought, no, there's something additional. You could have all of these other dimensions, but you could have them in a non-resilient way. You could have them in a very vulnerable way that you could lose them quite quickly. So there is something additional about having them in a resilient way, and it's about the way they're provided and the networks they're provided through. If you think about adaptation and think about communities that manage to survive disasters, they will design their systems in ways that they can bounce back or recover or rebuild differently. So that's where the concept comes from. When I was trying to measure the dimensions of the social foundation, it was one of three, along with jobs, voice, and resilience. Those were the three that I found I couldn't get an international measure on. I was looking for measures for all of them, went from 0% to 100% of what proportion of people in the world have this social dimension. And I couldn't get one that was relevant across the world. If anybody out there knows good measures of resilience and thinks actually there's some, I'd be really, really interested to do it. Again, I'm revising this and updating it, so I'd love to look at new measures of what measuring resilience could look like, but I don't have that.
We're coming up to the end, rather frustratingly, but before we've got, what? Oh, good. We've got a few minutes still, so I want to just sort of shift gear a little bit to a set of questions. Actually, I like Maxwell Otieno's question here. If we assumed that all countries adopted and used the doughnut economy, would we achieve sustainability on Earth? There's several other related questions, I think, that ask something like, what are the top things that we need to do to remain within the doughnut, or what are the most important steps that need to be taken for global sustainability? I know that you have had, well, I've watched you for 2 years having immense discussions about this with all sorts of people, so I'm sure that you've got some views.
Okay. I love the question. So what if every country in the world had a doughnut economy? Would we achieve sustainable development? Well, the short answer to that would be yes, by definition, because if the economy fitted inside the doughnut, that's what I would say is inclusive and sustainable development. But I don't think he's asking that question. But the doughnut, I mean, if you look at it, all it is, it's a set of 20 goals. There's 9 planetary goals, and or environmental goals, you could say, and there's 11 social goals. So it's not, sometimes people say, what is doughnut economics? How do you do it? It's not a set of policies, it's not a set of institutions or things to do, or it's a set of goals. And I find that really compelling, because I do think economics is missing a clear goal, and so it's adopted growth as its alternative, and we know that's not enough. What happens if we put goals back at the center and then ask ourselves backwards from that, what kind of economy would we design if we wanted to achieve those goals? It would be an economy that took human rights seriously. It's an economy that started by recognizing, respecting planetary boundaries, and asking, how would you design economic systems? You just mentioned cap and trade or tax, or how should we do that? How would you design economic systems that respect that, rather than encourage us to go over them, which is the system we currently have? So doughnut economics is in a way a question. What is the economic mindset that would help take us in the doughnut? And that's what I'm trying to do writing a book about it. It's a question, and to me, I'm drawing on a lot of fantastic heterodox economic thought that's been going on for decades, from feminist economists, ecological economists, evolutionary economists, systems dynamics, and saying this is the mindset we need if we're going to get into that space. I do believe we could do it. I absolutely believe we could do it, that it would be feasible to manage our planetary household in a way that every human being on Earth had the resources they need to meet their essential human rights, and that we could do it within the ecological integrity of the 9 planetary boundaries. It's a huge political challenge. It's not an economic challenge. It's not even a technical challenge. It's a political challenge. It's about our aspirations, our expectations, our lock-in in these 4-year economic political cycles. So what are the top things I think should be done? Well, one nice thing that's coming out of the Sustainable Development Goal process is what's become known as #00. You can follow debates on Twitter. #00 stands for, is there really possibly a goal of 0 carbon emissions and 0 poverty by 2030 or 2050? We could have those 2 things. If we said let's have 0 carbon emissions stop climate change, and if we had zero poverty, which I absolutely believe is possible, you could almost assemble the phone book of the poorest billion people in the world today. And once you get that phone book, you can send them money electronically. I mean, we're the first generation who actually has that capacity to do it. So zero carbon emissions, zero poverty for starters. Two big goals, I'd say. I'm passionate about transforming the mindset, because if we don't transform the way we think, we will keep doing the old stuff. So I'll go for zero carbon, zero poverty, and zero
stupidity.
Classical economics. Let's reinvent it. What would you add?
I actually wouldn't add anything. I think that I'm really pleased that we end up sort of with so much agreement, even though I'm not an economist yet. What's the time? 3 minutes. We've got two more minutes. I just want to pick up, there's one last strand of things that really resonated for me, and that I think it was Osbert Lancaster again says, a lot of the social foundation relates, looks very similar, for instance, to Max Neef's focus on needs, or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and other people who sort of really concerned about these foundations. There was another question too, which is, when you're talking to politicians, including some of the most powerful in the world, we've got power, and the values that shape the economy at the moment are very much held in the hands of the 1% or the 11%. How do we square that circle? How do we, I can't even think about what the precise question is, but how do we start to balance this fact of meeting people's needs, which is absolutely at the heart of global sustainability, with the fact that a small proportion of the world are so far removed from having to experience life at those needs?
Okay, I'm just going to, we've only got a couple of minutes, I'll jump in and answer that question. I think for a long time in economic thinking, inequality was seen as a matter of personal preference. Everybody said, well, some inequality is good, it spurs growth, it spurs competition. How much you think should be allowed, that's a sort of personal, national, political, social preference. It's, as you like, raise or lower the dial as you like. And what we've seen, I'd say, starting with Wilkinson and Pickett's book, The Spirit Level, so hang on a minute, this isn't just about personal preference, this has profound, clear social consequences. And unequal societies do worse on almost all social dimensions across the society. So first we had that actually inequality is socially damaging. Then we have people coming out and saying, actually it's politically damaging. Al Gore saying, US democracy has been hacked, and the hack is campaign finance. And when we have such wealthy individuals who are literally buying the power of political parties, then we no longer have a democratic system. And then in the financial crisis, people start to say, why did this crisis happen? Because there's too much money owned by too few people looking to lend it to people who can't repay it. So the inequality is in itself economically destabilizing. And we can see from looking at who's putting pressure on the planet that is ecologically destabilizing. So I think we're living in a moment where economics used to say, you know what, inequality, it's up to you how much you think you should have. Personal preference, nobody can tell you otherwise. Now we recognize it's socially divisive. We recognize it's politically undermining. We recognize that it's economically destabilizing and it's ecologically degrading. Inequality is not sustainable and not desirable by societies. And I think once we're seeing these facts, and more mainstream economists are talking about it. The World Economic Forum has for 2 years in a row put inequality as its top international risk. So we can't carry on with a world in which 85 billionaires have as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. It's absurd, and it's undermining everything that we value. So I think rather than saying we have an unequal world, how do we try and communicate them? We need to change that, and we need large-scale mobilization, people's mobilization, saying to government, I'm sorry, this is just absurd. We are fed up with seeing billionaires and corporations get off with paying no taxes and running off to tax havens. It's undermining all of our societies. Please change the policies that you have. And we're back to the bumper cars, right? How do we get those bumper cars going round? I don't know, but we have to push on all of those bumper cars. The good thing is the evidence against inequality is irrevocable, and it's indisputable now, thanks to Thomas Piketty.
Woohoo! With that, charge to shuffle your own bumper car wherever you are, ladies and gentlemen. I think we have to draw this Hangout to an end. Kate, it's just been absolutely wonderful, as it always is, to
Pleasure.
go scooting over so many issues so quickly.
Great question.
Yeah, there have been absolutely outstanding questions, and there's loads of questions that we haven't been able to touch on, but I think we've done most of the themes that people have mentioned. I'm getting a nod from the MOOC team here. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I look forward to seeing you on the forum.
Cheers.
Bye, Kate.
Bye.